US Vice President J.D. Vance requested President Volodymyr Zelensky to halt drone strikes on oil tankers. That request followed July attacks that cut oil loadings by 300,000 barrels daily. Supporters say market limits protect donors, while critics argue they harm battlefield defense. Should military aid depend on global economic stability? What's your opinion on where allies should draw the line? In July 2026, Ukrainian drone strikes hit oil tankers near the Novorossiysk terminal. These attacks reduced crude exports by 300,000 barrels per day. Shipping and insurance rates more than doubled across the region. American energy companies Chevron and ExxonMobil hold major stakes in the Tengiz oil field, feeding that pipeline. One chartered tanker was even damaged during the July strikes. Ukraine later agreed to limit strikes while seeking American Patriot missiles. Tom, should allies tie military aid to market stability?
Yes, Western allies must protect global economic stability to keep military support alive. To view this clearly, donor nations require stable public finances to sustain long-term aid. When recipient drone strikes trigger energy supply shocks, fuel prices surge for Western taxpayers. High energy costs constrain central bank policy and worsen cost of living crises for families. Unmanaged economic spillovers then fuel political pressure against foreign military spending. If Western voters face severe inflation, public backing for aid will rapidly erode. Conditioning aid ensures tactical decisions do not destroy the macroeconomic foundation. What demands our full attention is the problem of collateral economic damage. Ukrainian drone strikes near Novorossiysk disrupted Kazakh crude exports bound for European allies. Those attacks also damaged a commercial tanker chartered by American energy firm ExxonMobil. Aid recipients should not take unilateral actions that inflict damage on neutral trading partners. Economic conditions align tactical battlefield operations with global market stability. Without firm guardrails, localized military operations can easily trigger systemic market shocks.
Tom argues that energy shocks undermine voter willingness to sustain military defense spending. He adds that economic guardrails prevent tactical strikes from harming neutral trading partners. Emily, how do you respond to imposing these market conditions on defense aid?
I recognise that risk, but conditioning aid forces defenders to sacrifice survival for market convenience. When American officials requested a halt to drone strikes, Ukraine was seeking Patriot missiles. Asking a nation under attack to curb strikes on enemy logistics weakens their self-defence. Subordinating defensive hardware to commodity prices leaves defenders facing devastating missile strikes. Allies should not force a defending country to choose between market comfort and military survival. Imposing economic conditions also creates a dangerous moral hazard for Western security. American energy firms Chevron and ExxonMobil hold 50 and 25% stakes in Tengiz oil. That oil flows through the Caspian pipeline, giving adversary shipping a commercial shield. If allies restrict aid over market fear, aggressive regimes will exploit shared infrastructure. Hostile forces will deliberately route war logistics through commercial choke points to avoid attack. Conditioning aid effectively immunises the enemy's war engine behind Western corporate interests.
Emily argues that market conditions force defenders to compromise their immediate physical survival. She warns that protecting shared trade routes allows aggressors to shield military supply chains. Tom, how do you address the threat of enemy forces using commercial shields?
I grant that temporary targeting limits can restrict immediate battlefield choices against enemy logistics. However, economic guardrails create a structured diplomatic bargaining mechanism for recipient nations. Recipients can trade operational restraint in sensitive areas for higher priority defensive assets. By halting Black Sea tanker strikes near Novorossiysk, Ukraine demonstrated strategic alignment with allies. That decision directly facilitated diplomatic progress to secure support for Patriot air defense missiles. Operational restraint does not mean weakening defense. It secures vital hardware that saves cities. Trading targeted oil strikes for interceptor missiles ultimately strengthens overall recipient airspace defense. Aligning military tactics with market stability preserves the political trust required for long-term supply. Without that trust, political friction inside donor capitals could halt future military transfers completely. Strategic coordination ensures defense assistance remains politically viable over prolonged conflicts.
Tom contends that operational restraint provides leverage to secure advanced defensive hardware. He stresses that coordination maintains donor political trust over multi-year defense commitments. Emily, can tactical bargaining truly offset the strategic costs of military restrictions?
I grant that energy supply disruptions create genuine financial strain for Western donor citizens. However, global market volatility is overwhelmingly driven by systemic macro shocks, not recipient strikes. In April 2026, global crude oil prices surged above $126 per barrel. That surge stemmed from Middle East conflict fears rather than pipeline disruptions in the Black Sea. Furthermore, global economic stability was maintained primarily through strategic petroleum reserve drawdowns. Donor nations possess macroeconomic buffers and strategic oil reserves to cushion market volatility. Conditioning military assistance completely misdiagnoses the primary causes of commodity price movements. Restricting an ally's defensive operations penalises recipient security without stabilising global energy markets. Allies should rely on strategic reserves to manage inflation rather than restricting essential battlefield strikes. Forcing defenders to absorb military risks while donors hold reserve buffers is fundamentally unfair. Suppressing vital military action solves neither inflation nor long-term geopolitical instability.
We have now arrived at the crux of today's debate. Today's conflict over Black Sea tanker strikes brings us back to one deciding question. Should Western allies prioritise recipient nations' immediate self-defence operations or donor nations' macroeconomic stability? Tom stresses that safeguarding donor economies preserves long-term political capacity to sustain military assistance. Emily argues that conditioning aid forces defenders to sacrifice existential security priorities for market convenience. Looking at recent precedent, global energy shocks in 2026 were buffered through strategic oil reserves. That demonstrates donor nations possess policy tools like strategic reserves to cushion energy price volatility. To evaluate whether this strategy works, we have a clear indicator to check in 6 months. We must observe whether recipient compliance with guardrails leads to the successful delivery of Patriot interceptors. We will also track whether energy inflation leads to public demand for aid reductions in donor countries. That outcome will demonstrate whether economic conditions protect long-term alliance cohesion or weaken vital military defense. Now it's time for your turn, where we look at useful debate phrases. First, to introduce a clear perspective, Tom said, "To view this clearly." To view this clearly, donor nations need stable public finances. To view this clearly, we must evaluate both long-term risks. To view this clearly, strategic alignment helps protect alliances. Next, to highlight a key issue, Tom used, "What demands our full attention is." What demands our full attention is the problem of collateral damage. What demands our full attention is how inflation impacts voters. What demands our full attention is whether military aid remains sustainable. Finally, to concede before making a counter-argument, Emily said, "I recognise that risk. But military defence must come first. I recognize that risk. But donor economies possess reserve buffers. I recognize that risk, but market stability requires strategic balance. Try using one of today's expressions in the comments below. Thank you for watching, and join us next time on The Breakfast Debate.